The throne of England had long been a battlefield of blood and ambition, but few monarchs left as infamous a legacy as King Henry VIII. Born in 1491, Henry was not originally destined to rule. His elder brother Arthur was the heir to the Tudor crown. Yet fate intervened when Arthur died young, leaving Henry next in line. At just 18, he inherited the throne in 1509, bursting with youthful charm, strength, and a hunger to prove himself as more than just a replacement king. Henry began his reign as the perfect image of a Renaissance monarch. Handsome, tall, and skilled in sports and music, he won the admiration of his subjects. Courtiers praised his golden hair, his commanding presence, and his intellect. He was a king who seemed destined to bring glory to England. Yet beneath this glittering surface lay a darker ambition, an obsession with control, an impatience with opposition, and an ego that tolerated no challenge. The seeds of tyranny were already taking root. Marriage was the first battlefield where Henry's power and cruelty would be tested. In a bid to keep dynastic ties intact, he married Catherine of Aragon, his late brother's widow. Catherine was noble, pious, and deeply devoted to her husband. For years, their marriage appeared strong, and Catherine bore Henry several children. But one after another, the infants died in infancy, save for one surviving daughter, Mary. For Henry, who craved a male heir to secure his dynasty, this was a devastating failure. Obsessed with the idea of continuing the Tudor line, Henry's frustration with Catherine grew into bitterness. The once doting husband became cold, dismissive, and cruel. Catherine pleaded with him to accept God's will, but Henry's pride could not bear the thought of leaving the kingdom to a woman. His longing for a son twisted into desperation, and desperation soon became obsession. He was convinced that Catherine was cursed and that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. It was during this storm of dissatisfaction that Henry met Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting at court. Anne was witty, ambitious, and strikingly different from the quiet, devout Catherine. Where Catherine yielded, Anne resisted. She refused to become Henry's mistress, demanding instead that he marry her. For Henry, this defiance was intoxicating. Anne became the object of his obsession, and Henry began plotting a way to rid himself of Catherine. The trail of executions had not yet begun, but the shadow of the axe already loomed. Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, claiming it was invalid in God's eyes. Catherine fought fiercely, refusing to yield her crown or her dignity. She appealed to the Pope, igniting what became known as the King's Great Matter. For years, the struggle dragged on, with Henry growing more enraged by each obstacle placed in his path. To him, Catherine was no longer just a wife. She was an enemy standing in the way of his desires. And Henry was a man who destroyed those who opposed him. The Pope's refusal to grant the annulment drove Henry into open defiance of the Catholic Church. This defiance would alter the course of English history forever. In a ruthless act of defiance, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with Rome. Bishops, priests, and nobles were forced to choose between loyalty to their faith or obedience to their king. Those who resisted faced imprisonment, torture, and death. Henry's thirst for power had now spilled beyond his marriage. It consumed his kingdom. With his new authority, Henry cast Catherine aside and married Anne Boleyn in secret. Catherine was stripped of her title, her daughter Mary declared illegitimate, and she was banished from court. Her health withered under the stress, but her dignity never faltered. She spent her final years isolated, dying a broken but unbowed queen. For Henry, it was a cold and calculated triumph, but it also set the stage for the bloodshed to come. Anne, the woman he had defied the world to marry, would soon discover that the king's love was as deadly as it was passionate. Anne's marriage to Henry began with triumph but quickly unraveled under pressure. Like Catherine before her, Anne struggled to provide Henry with the son he so desperately desired. She gave birth to Elizabeth, who would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. But to Henry, she was merely another disappointment. When further pregnancies ended in miscarriage, Henry's adoration turned to suspicion. He began whispering that Anne was cursed, that her failure to bear him a son was a sign of witchcraft. At court, enemies circled Anne like vultures. She had been proud, often sharp-tongued, and had made powerful foes. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, saw her as a threat to his own influence. Together with Henry's growing impatience, these whispers became daggers aimed at the Queen's throat. Soon, Anne found herself accused of adultery, treason, and even incest with her own brother. The charges were fabricated, but in Henry's court, truth mattered little when the king wanted blood. Anne's trial was a farce, a performance meant to justify what Henry had already decided. Witnesses lied, evidence was twisted, and the queen who had once enchanted the king now stood helpless before his wrath. In May of 1536, Anne was taken to the Tower of London, her fate sealed. She never begged for her life, but carried herself with dignity, knowing that history would judge her differently than her husband did. Her words on the scaffold were calm, her prayer sincere, but the axe was merciless. With a single stroke, Anne Boleyn's head fell, and Henry moved on as if she had been nothing more than an obstacle in his path. Within days, he married Jane Seymour, his third wife. The speed of the transition shocked even his courtiers, but it revealed the truth. Henry's heart was a graveyard where love was quickly buried and forgotten. Catherine had been discarded and executed, and Jane was now expected to succeed where they had failed to give the king a son. Yet Anne's death marked more than the loss of a queen. It signaled the beginning of a reign ruled by fear. Courtiers whispered carefully, nobles walked on trembling feet, and even the closest advisers knew that one misstep could lead to the executioner's block. Henry had shown the kingdom that wives, ministers, and even the church itself were expendable when set against his desires. The axe had tasted royal blood, and it would not be the last time. The legend of Henry VIII as the executioner king had begun. Catherine had been humiliated, Anne had been silent, and Jane's turn was coming. Each wife would step into his court hoping for love or survival, but few would escape the shadow of his cruelty. For Henry, marriage was no longer about companionship or alliance, it was about domination. And for the women who bore his crown, it was a gamble that often ended at the blade of the axe. Jane Seymour entered Henry's life like a balm to his wounded pride. Unlike Catherine's stubborn defiance or Anne's fiery wit, Jane was gentle, soft-spoken, and obedient. To Henry, who now craved peace after years of turmoil, she was a perfect contrast. Within days of Anne Boleyn's execution, he married Jane, as though wiping away the memory of his former wife with terrifying speed. But behind Jane's modest demeanor was the same expectation that had haunted her predecessors, the demand to give Henry a son. For once, Henry's obsession seemed rewarded. In 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward, the long-awaited male heir who would secure the Tudor line. Henry was ecstatic, parading himself as God's chosen king, finally blessed with the son he had long craved. Yet fate proved cruel. Just days after Edward's birth, Jane fell gravely ill from complications and died. Henry was inconsolable, or so he claimed, declaring Jane his true wife. Yet his grief soon hardened in the justification Jane had given him a son, something Catherine and Anne had failed to do. In his mind, she alone had been worthy. The death of Jane left Henry widowed and restless. His body had grown heavier, his temper sharper, and his health weaker. Yet his political ambitions had not faded. By 1540, his advisors sought a new marriage that would strengthen England's alliances in Europe. They presented Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose portrait promised beauty and grace. But when Anne arrived in England, Henry was enraged. She was not the woman he had imagined, and he reportedly sneered that she looked like a Flanders Mare. From the start, the marriage was doomed. Henry could not bring himself to love Anne, and his pride was wounded by the mismatch. Within months, he demanded an annulment, claiming the union had never been consummated. Unlike Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn, Anne of Cleves wisely avoided defiance. She yielded to Henry's wishes, accepting the title of the king's sister and retreating from court with a generous settlement. In doing so, she became the rare wife who escaped the shadow of Henry's cruelty, an exception in a pattern drenched in blood. But Henry's thirst for passion and control soon led him to Catherine Howard, a young lady-in-waiting barely out of her teenage years. Where Jane had been meek and Anne of Cleves prudent, Catherine Howard was youthful, flirtatious, and vibrant. Henry, now in his late 40s, was bloated ill and plagued with pain from a festering leg wound. Yet Catherine's presence made him feel young again. He called her his rose without a thorn, showering her with gifts, titles, and affection. For a brief moment, the king seemed reborn. But behind the glittering facade, danger brewed. Catherine had a past flirtations and youthful indiscretions that Henry's enemies soon uncovered. Gossip spread through the court, whispering that the queen was unfaithful. Whether the accusations were true or not hardly mattered. For Henry, betrayal was intolerable. The court that had once adored Catherine turned against her, and soon she found herself accused of adultery, the same crime that had doomed Anne Boleyn. The queen who had danced with joy and laughter now trembled before the axe. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, Catherine wept as the reality of her fate set in. Unlike Anne, whose final moments were calm and dignified, Catherine was said to have been overwhelmed with terror. On the day of her execution in 1542, she is rumored to have begged for mercy, though none came. With a single stroke, her young life ended, and Henry left another broken body in the wake of his insatiable appetites. By now, the pattern of Henry's reign had become clear. Wives were not companions but pawns, discarded or destroyed when they no longer pleased him. The court lived in constant fear, for if queens could fall so swiftly, what hope was there for ministers or nobles? Thomas Cromwell, once the architect of Anne Boleyn's downfall, learned this truth too late. When Henry grew dissatisfied with the failure of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Cromwell was blamed and sent to the executioner's block. The king's cruelty was boundless, sparing no one, not even those who had once served him faithfully. Henry's health continued to decline, his body swollen and riddled with disease. Yet his appetite for power, for control, remained unshaken. His court became a theater of paranoia, where alliances shifted with each whisper and suspicion could mean death. The wives who had passed through his hands discarded, humiliated, or executed were testaments to a reign defined not by love, but by fear. Catherine of Aragon banished, Anne Boleyn beheaded, Jane Seymour dead, Anne of Cleves cast aside, and Catherine Howard executed. The blood of women was now indelibly tied to his crown. And yet, even after Catherine Howard's brutal end, Henry was not finished. His reign still had years to run, and his hunger for companionship, control, and legacy had not been sated. The kingdom trembled as the question lingered. Would another woman dare to wear the crown of a man whose love so often ended at the executioner's block? Henry's reputation as the executioner king had now become legend. His trail of wives was etched into history not as stories of love, but as warnings of ambition, betrayal, and tyranny. The axe had already claimed 2 queens, and whispers haunted the court that the blood of more would flow before Henry himself met his end. After Catherine Howard's execution, Henry VIII was once again without a queen. His health had deteriorated severely, his once athletic frame now weighed down by obesity, his festering leg wound reeking so badly that courtiers struggled to stand near him. Yet even as his body failed, his mind remained sharp, and his need for companionship grew stronger. Few dared to accept the crown, for by now it was clear. Being Henry's wife was as dangerous as standing before the executioner's axe. Into this storm stepped Catherine Parr, Henry's 6th and final wife. Unlike his previous brides, Catherine was no youthful beauty nor ambitious courtier seeking advancement. She was a mature woman, intelligent, devout, and cautious. Twice widowed before, she understood the precarious role of a queen better than most. Where Anne Boleyn had challenged Henry and Catherine Howard had entertained him, Catherine Parr became his caretaker, soothing his temper and tending to his failing health. Her relationship with Henry was not one of passion but of pragmatism. She treated him with respect, indulged his need for authority, and managed his moods with tact. Yet Catherine Parr was more than a nursemaid. She was also a reformer. A believer in the Protestant faith, she quietly supported the spread of new religious ideas, even publishing a book under her own name. For Henry, who still wavered between Catholic traditions and Protestant reform, this was dangerous ground. Whispers of heresy began to swirl around Catherine Parr, spread by enemies at court who sought to destroy her. Henry, fickle as ever, grew suspicious. One day, the king reportedly signed a warrant for her arrest, planning to have her seized and questioned on charges of heresy. Catherine, however, was quick to act. Throwing herself at Henry's mercy, she cleverly claimed that her religious debates were never meant to teach him, but to distract him from his suffering leg. The king, flattered, withdrew the warrant. For the first time, a wife had outmaneuvered the executioner king and lived to tell the tale. Catherine Parr survived Henry, but her life was far from peaceful. She was forced to walk a delicate line between loyalty and independence, between obedience and survival. While she managed to keep her head, the fear of execution always hung over her like a shadow. Yet through her patience, she not only saved herself, but also reconciled Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, restoring them to the line of succession. In doing so, she shaped the future of England more profoundly than Henry himself could have foreseen. Henry's final years were marked by paranoia, cruelty, and decline. His body was ravaged by disease, his temper more volatile than ever. Ministers and nobles continued to fall victim to his suspicions. Those who once stood proudly in his favor were dragged to the scaffold with little warning. The court became a place of silent and trembling loyalty, where even the smallest gesture of disobedience could invite ruin. By the time Henry died in 1547, the once dazzling king who had enchanted his people was a bloated tyrant despised by many. His 6 marriages had left a trail of broken women, 2 discarded, 2 executed, 1 dead in childbirth, and 1 narrowly surviving his wrath. The image of Henry as the Renaissance prince had been replaced with the legacy of the executioner king, whose appetite for power and domination had stained his reign with blood. Yet history's irony is cruel. The son he had fought so desperately to secure, Edward VI, ruled only briefly before dying young. His great legacy did not come from the male heir he so prized, but from the 2 daughters he had cast aside. Mary would rise as the first reigning queen of England, and Elizabeth would go on to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. ushering in an age of glory Henry himself had only dreamed of. The wives of Henry VIII became symbols in their own right. Catherine of Aragon, remembered for her dignity; Anne Boleyn for her ambition and tragic death; Jane Seymour for her sacrifice; Anne of Cleves for her survival; Catherine Howard for her youthful folly; and Catherine Parr for her wisdom and endurance. Together, they told the story of a king whose marriages reflected not love, but tyranny and fear. Henry's reign became a warning to history about the dangers of unchecked power and obsession. His marriages were not private tragedies, but public spectacles, where queens became pawns in a deadly game of politics, religion, and desire. The executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard echoed through time as chilling reminders of how swiftly Henry's passion could turn to cruelty. Even today, Henry VIII is remembered less for his political maneuvers or military campaigns, and more for his wives, their fates inseparable from his. The rhyme taught the children: divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived, is a haunting summary of his reign. It is not Henry's victories or his reforms that linger in the public mind, but the image of the axe falling on innocent queens. The Tower of London, where Anne and Catherine met their end, still stands as a grim monument to Henry's legacy. Visitors walk the same stone paths where queens once wept, prayed, and met their fate. The ghosts of Henry's wives are said to linger there, eternal reminders of the executioner king's cruelty. In the silence of those ancient walls, one can still sense the terror of a court where love was fleeting and death was always near.